Dish is located in the middle of the Barnett Shale, which is the most productive natural gas field in the United States. The slick water hydraulic fracturing that they're using in the deep shale formations was developed about 15 miles to the west of Dish by a company called Mitchell Energy. The industry says that there have been hydraulic fracturing going on for 60 years, and that's about a half-truth, because there's been forms of it going on for 60 years. But the slick water, what they call slick water hydraulic fracturing, was developed in the late 90s by George Mitchell, Mitchell Energy. That company's been sold to Devon Energy, and that's also the company that developed the horizontal drilling. Now recently, George Mitchell came out and said that there needs to be tighter regulations on slick water hydraulic fracturing. The godfather, the guy who invented this, says that this is not regulated enough. So this is just a number of the wells. We've got 5,000 square miles. There's about 15,000 wells. These numbers are a little bit older, so there may be a little bit more than that right now, with a number of other wells that are permitted. And according to industry investor literature, there can be 100,000 wells in the Barnett Shale. Here's the Atrium, which apparently there have been some drilling going on here for quite some time. That's a shallower shale. The shale that covers the rest of the state is not on this map, but that just kind of gives you an idea of how much of this is going on around the United States. Here's a mock-up of what happens when you perform hydraulic fracturing. They drill the well and drill down into the shale, do the fracturing, put a couple of million gallons of water, some sand, some chemicals under about 8 to 12,000 psi. Fractures the shale. The silica sand holds the fractures open so the gas can flow. I'm going to give you about 45 minutes or so here. You could probably talk for hours on each one of these slides that I'm showing you. I mean, it's a pretty deep subject. So it has to go through a process before it becomes the cleanest burning hydrocarbon, right? Dish is located kind of just outside of the urban sprawl of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. So we're a pretty popular route for pipelines. So most of the pipelines that converge, that go through the Barnett Shale converge in Dish. And so they've installed the compression stations to keep the gas pressurized, to push it out into the system, and the processing and the odorization to facilitate those pipelines. Here's an aerial photo, a little bit closer, of the compression facility, the treating facility. Now in Texas, we can permit the actual drilling of the well. The well sites can be permitted by the town. So we can put in additional limitations. Can't stop it, but we can put in additional limitations. However, with the companies like this, they're called pipeline midstream companies. So for one, they have the power of eminent domain. So this can be built whether you want it or not. And so can the midstream pipelines. And municipalities are preempted from many things in dealing with this. So the only thing that we can regulate on a facility like this is aesthetics, nuisance. Nuisance is noise. So if you look, as they come into the town, they're enclosed, they're painted neutral colors. You can make them put a fence around it, a bush around it, things like that. That's pretty much the extent of what we can do. And this has actually went to court and been, I mean, that's what case law tells us we can do. So if you look at these over here, they have these walls up, but these walls weren't initially installed. Now the horsepower on these engines go from about 1,300 horsepower up to about 3,500 horsepower. So these things are pretty loud. You can just imagine a 3,500 horsepower engine running 24 hours a day, 1,000 feet from your house. Kind of sounds like a diesel tractor sitting in your yard 24/7. So that is what they initially did. Now this facility right here is Enbridge. You guys have heard of Enbridge, right? Yeah. So Enbridge wasn't necessarily cooperative, but since I have a warm personality, they went ahead and installed the sound walls. Strangely enough, right before Josh filmed Gasland, they installed those sound walls. So in the state of Texas, we have what we call permit by rule. And under permit by rule, if you don't reach a certain emissions threshold, then you just fill out an application, you send it into the state agency. As long as all the squares are filled and the check clears, you get your permit. And that's literally the process. So each one of these were permitted under permit by rule. When I told the state regulatory agencies about this, they had no idea that they had permitted these 5 sites right next to one another. Southern Methodist University did a study a few years ago. They came out and said the emissions from oil and gas equipment in the Barnett Shale was higher than all of the vehicular traffic in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. The state regulatory agency came out and said, no way. So they went and did their math, and they came back and said, you're right. They installed equipment such as this, which is a glycol dehydrator, and it removes all of the impurities in the gas. And it produces a horrible, horrible odor. If you did a public information request to the state of Texas for all the complaints filed for odor by people in Dish, there would be hundreds of them. So we did our own study. We spent about 15% of our small budget to do an air study. We tested for a few things other than methane. Methane's actually odorless, so you can't smell it anyway. Ours came back with a little different outcome. This is a quote from ours. Laboratory results confirm the presence of multiple recognized and suspected human carcinogens in the fugitive air emissions present on several locations tested in the town of Dish. Now, I couldn't really get our regulatory agencies involved. They weren't interested in helping us at all. And then we released the results of our air study, and then I couldn't throw a rock and not hit 2 of them. They were all over the place. Just like every good mayor, it was the Saturday after we released this air study, I was putting together a popcorn machine at the municipal building, and I look outside and I got a parking lot full of these TCEQ trucks, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. They've got all kinds of testing equipment. They were everywhere. So they did their own study. Just happen to have a copy of this. They showed up not to protect us, but to protect the industry. Not to be outdone, the industry did their study. They did an air study. The Barnett Shale Energy Education Council performed a study in Fort Worth and Arlington. So this would have been the best case scenario. Whenever they showed up with their testing equipment, the operators would have known well in advance that this was going to happen. They found extremely high levels of formaldehyde in some of their sampling. Now, the combustion of natural gas produces formaldehyde. Every one of these compressors are run on natural gas. So each one of them is permitted to release a certain amount of formaldehyde. But the point is, if you took only the lab results of each of these three studies and looked at only the lab results, they're almost exact. You find the same chemicals, you find them in exceedances of established safe levels, and you find it over and over and over again. However, you've seen what our study says. The state study says we found a few problems. The industry fixed some of them. We're going to keep studying. We're going to keep testing. The industry study said, "See, we told you everything's fine." How much benzene do you want to be exposed to? How much benzene do you want your kids to be exposed to? Do you have a choice in that matter? This is a friend of mine, Tim Ruggiero. He was on 60 Minutes. He's been pretty outspoken about this. Tim was purchasing this property. He bought 10 acres in the country so that he could have horses for his daughter. When he was signing to buy the home, there's a form that says, "You understand you do not own the minerals of this property." He said, "What's this mean?" They said, "Well, if you're digging in your garden, you hit oil, it's not yours. Somebody else's." That doesn't sound all that bad. So, Tim travels. So he's off on a business trip. His wife gets up, takes their daughter to school, goes to work. They get a phone call from their neighbor saying, "There's a bunch of equipment on your property." So without notice, a drilling company showed up, cut Tim's fence down, and proceeded to bulldoze 4 of his 10 acres. They were good neighbors, though, because they actually pinned his horses up in the barn so that they wouldn't run off. So this was Tim's view outside of his kitchen window for about 6 weeks. This is Tim's property from an aerial view. You can see just the amount of land that was taken for this process. Here's the wellheads. Here is the condensate tank that wasn't already destructed. And in Texas, the waste pits are not required to be lined. There's a couple of states that have that requirement in place. The industry is pretty active in trying to get those requirements taken away. There's Tim's daughter in their playground. So you know, when I started this,